Hey everyone, and welcome to our explainer. Today, we're diving into a huge national experiment out of Japan, something called Womenomics. Now, this was a really bold plan, right? The idea was to fix a totally broken economy by tapping into its most underutilized resource, its women. But here's the big question. What happens when a super modern 21st century economic fix just smashes headfirst into centuries of tradition? And that brings us to the central question for this whole explainer. Can a policy that's specifically designed to empower women accidentally create a whole new set of social problems? The answer isn't a simple yes or no. It actually reveals some pretty uncomfortable truths about just how hard it is to force change from the top down.
All right, Section 1, the promise of Womenomics. So to really get this policy, you first have to understand the crisis that made it necessary in the first place.
So picture this. For almost 20 years, Japan was just stuck. I mean, they were in a major economic rut. Growth was stagnant, the workforce was shrinking, you get the picture. The old ways of doing business, they just weren't cutting it anymore. Something big had to change.
And that's when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe rolls out his big solution. It had this really catchy name, Womenomics. The logic behind it was actually pretty simple. If you get more women into the workforce, you solve your labor shortage and you kickstart the whole economy. I mean, on paper, it sounds like a total win-win, right? And you know what? The initial results were absolutely staggering. The numbers just don't lie. Between 2012 and 2016, the number of women in the workforce jumped by almost 5%. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but for an economy as massive as Japan's, a shift like that in just 4 years is, well, it's huge.
So, by the numbers, it looked like a total home run. The government set a goal, and the data showed they were crushing it. But this is where the story gets way more complicated. Was it really the runaway success it seemed to be? Okay, Section 2, Policy meets Patriarchy. And this right here is where things get fascinating. Because this big top-down government policy was about to run smack into a culture that had been built up over centuries.
So to really get this collision, we have to talk about patriarchy in Japan. And look, this isn't just some abstract academic idea. It's a real social system with deep roots in Confucian values that has shaped Japanese society for hundreds of years. It basically puts men in charge, giving them power and authority both out in the world and inside the home. And this quote, it just perfectly captures the ideal man in that system. They called him the salaryman, and he was basically the hero of Japan's post-war economic boom. His whole identity was wrapped up in his company. He was expected to be this kind of corporate warrior, working insane hours, dedicating his entire life to his job, not his family. That was the definition of success. So you had these incredibly rigid, clearly defined roles. Men, they were the providers. Their world was the office. Women, their job was to manage the home and raise the kids. So you can see, Womenomics wasn't just asking women to, pick up a part-time job. It was threatening the entire fundamental social order. Okay, Section 3, the unintended consequences. So this clash between the new policy and the old culture, well, it led to some really serious and mostly unforeseen problems. The culture, you could say, started to push back hard. Remember that amazing jump in the number of women working? Well, here's the fine print. A huge chunk of these new jobs were what they call non-regular positions. Think part-time, contract work, stuff with low pay, zero benefits, and absolutely no job security. Sure, it made the employment stats look great, but it didn't really do much to boost women's careers or their actual economic power. And as more women tried to build actual careers, a really toxic new thing started happening in the workplace. It got so common it even earned its own name, matahara. It's basically a mashup of the words maternity and harassment. And it was a direct, ugly backlash against women who were trying to have both a career and a family. And we're not talking about a few isolated incidents here. Just how bad was it? Well, a survey back in 2014 found that 26.3%, that's more than 1 in every 4 working women, said they had been a victim of this maternity harassment. It was a crystal clear signal from the culture that deep down, a woman's real job was still seen as being at home. But the fallout from this massive cultural collision, it didn't just stay inside the office.
This shakeup of traditional gender roles created all these new pressures that just rippled out across the rest of society, affecting both men and women in some really profound ways.
This is what led to the rise of a group that sociologists gave a pretty harsh name: single parasites. This term describes adults, sometimes in their 30s, 40s, even their 50s, who haven't gotten married and are still living at home with their parents. I mean, think about it. With women becoming more economically independent and men struggling to live up to that impossible salaryman ideal, the whole traditional idea of starting a family just started to fall apart. And for some people, the pressure just became too much to handle. This led to the phenomenon of hikikomori. These are individuals, and they're mostly men, who basically respond to the pressure of not meeting society's expectations by just withdrawing completely. Because they feel they can't achieve that provider status, they retreat from social life altogether, sometimes locking themselves away for years.
Which brings us to our final section, the verdict. So after all of this, what's the final judgment on Womenomics? Was this really about economics, or was it about equality?
When you really break it all down, the final analysis is pretty clear. At its heart, Womenomics was an economic policy, not a gender equality initiative. The main goal was just to get more workers to boost the GDP. And hey, it did that. But it completely failed to account for the power of that deep-rooted patriarchal culture. That culture pushed back, hard, by sticking women in flimsy jobs and creating all these new social pressures that gave us things like matahara and hikikomori. And all of this leaves us with one final really big question. Can a government really engineer deep social change, something like genuine gender equality, just by using economic policies? Japan's whole experiment with Womenomics seems to suggest that if you don't deal with the cultural bedrock underneath it all, you might just end up trading one set of problems for a brand new one.